If you've been killing yourself in the gym, pushing every set to failure, and feeling perpetually sore and exhausted, yet your gains have stalled, or you're constantly fighting injuries, fatigue, and burnout, this episode is for you. Today, I'm sitting down with Jeff Alberts, known as the godfather of natural bodybuilding, to reveal why training smarter and efficiently, and not always more, might be the key to finally breaking through those strength and muscle plateaus. You'll discover how to build muscle sustainably without the constant grind that leaves you dreading your workouts. Whether you're a serious, experienced lifter or just getting started, this episode will give you a new perspective on training intensity and help you create a sustainable, long-term approach in the gym that doesn't burn you out. Welcome to Wits and Weights, the podcast that blends evidence and engineering to help you build smart, efficient systems to achieve your dream physique. I'm your host, Philip Pape, and today we're discussing the art and science of sustainable muscle building with none other than WNBF Pro natural bodybuilder Jeff Alberts. Jeff is widely known as the godfather of natural bodybuilding. With over 30 years of experience competing and coaching, he's helped hundreds of natural athletes achieve their goals through his company, 3D Muscle Journey, aka 3DMJ. And for anyone who's been following him for a while, you probably can appreciate his thoughtful, measured, and of course, evidence-based approach to training and nutrition. Today, you'll learn why constantly pushing yourself to the max might be slowing your progress, how to increase efficiency in your training, and practical ways to build muscle while staying fresh both mentally and physically. You'll discover how to manage fatigue intelligently and how to create longevity with your training. Jeff, it's an honor to have you on the show.
I appreciate you having me. And yeah, after that introduction, hopefully I can deliver. So we'll see.
You'll definitely deliver, my man. So, I mean, just for the listeners, Jeff's a really cool guy. When I reach out to him to schedule this podcast, I usually send out some topics and things, and he actually wrote back with like thoughts on each idea. And I was really impressed by that. It tells me what kind of coach he is as well. But having heard him on many other podcasts, I wanted to bring him on because you as a listener appreciate that data and evidence-based approach. And many of us we're in our 40s. I turn 44 tomorrow after we record this episode. And I'm always reflecting on how do I get the most out of my lifting without getting too much pain, without having to have surgery or have something hold me up along the way. And Jeff, a lot of lifters feel like they have to push harder and they have to train with a ton of volume. And they crash and burn. Then they switch up their program. They stop making progress, even though in the short term they might. And so for those who've been grinding at the gym, they go, multiple days a week, multiple years, and they're not seeing the results they expect, or maybe it's slowed down. What is the biggest impact on their long-term growth at that point?
I got to say happy birthday first.
Yeah. Thanks, man.
you still
44 years young.
Yeah. You got ways to go.
I do, man. It's all good.
Yeah. That's a long-winded question. That's pretty deep there. So we're talking about longevity, right?
Yeah, I know, man. I totally, these opening questions, I'm like, how simple or complex should they be? It's really like, people wonder, there are a lot of training variables and there's a lot of things you could change. And I think people change too much at one time.
Yeah.
If somebody is a lifter who loves to lift, who understands, methods of programming and the training variables, but they've gotten the tendonitis, they've had the hip, the labral tear, whatever it is, they've kind of gone up or down and it's felt flatlined maybe for a while. What's the thing that they need to change or think about first?
We need to understand pace. Because, we think about what are we trying to accomplish here? If we're talking about natural bodybuilding, it's a long man's game. It's not, you're not playing 9 holes of golf. You're trying to play 18. So you got to learn about pace. And it's like, yeah, we can look at all these shiny new toys that are out there. And we're gung-ho as far as trying to implement all these new things and trying to be really scientific. What it comes down to is what's practical and what is sustainable. And for myself personally, I always think about like what my current context is. I'm talking about life context. Same thing with my athletes that I coach. I'm like, okay, what does their actually daily life look like? And then from there, it's like, okay, what can we do? What can we do that's going to be productive, but yet it's time efficient and you're able to recover from it? And then from there, of course, you can kind of build things out. But I think it just comes down to pace. Like the reason I'm still doing it this long, it's kind of just understanding that I have to pace myself. And, I take myself back to my 20s, 30s. Like, obviously you can get away with a lot more things because your body's a little more pliable. So, there's some things I was doing that I'm sure I could have gone back and say, hey, let me improve upon the approach. And it would have been more of a conservative approach. I probably would have seen better progress because of it. But now it's like I really have to pay attention to my body. I got to pay attention to what life's throwing at me. And in a sense, like I keep saying, just controlling that pace is just so important. And it is. We always want to get further ahead, a lot faster.
Yeah.
So that's a problem. Like sometimes we just get in our own way, in a sense.
Yeah, I've heard people joke, especially the older lifters, that no matter how much you hear this message on a podcast, it's like until you experience it, you don't truly learn the lesson. And hopefully we can help people not have to experience more than they need to. But
you have kids, right?
Yeah.
Do you have kids?
Yeah, I have kids, 2 daughters.
So, you tell your kids you're blue in the face, don't do that. Don't do that, because it's going to happen, but they don't listen, and then they experience it, and they're like, oh, okay, now I know what you're talking about. So
yeah, man,
it's like
sticking that fork in the light socket.
It's good to throw out some seeds, but you gotta have them watered too. Sometimes you just gotta let people experience things as well.
Yeah, so I think that idea of pace, and it strikes up in me the idea of when we talk about efficiency, finding that minimum to make progress without going past that point, right? And there's a lot of discussion about overtraining, overreaching, building up fatigue, and so on. I guess when it comes to efficiency, what's the prevailing angle of attack here for efficiency? Is it minimum effective dose? Is it like, let's strip everything back and start from a very basic low volume approach?
What's minimum effective dose?
Okay, yeah, you tell me. What is that?
I don't know. Yeah. I have no idea. Like, I know what it is for me because I got enough experience. I've trial and errored so much to kind of know where that sweet spot is for me. But if I have someone that I'm, working with for the first time, I have no idea what they can handle, how they respond to it. It's a lot of trial and error. So it's like, okay, where science comes into play, it's like, okay, that 10 to 20 sets, general guideline. Okay, if I'm working from that, if I have someone who's new to lifting, like 20 sets probably not going to go over too well because they don't have the skill level yet with lifting. So it's like maybe 10 sets is too much. Like, I just want to focus on getting this person learning, teaching them how to move from A to B effectively, not so much worrying about the progress or the progressions with their lifts, more so like teaching them a skill. So it could be, maybe it's 6 sets a week. And let's just really make those 6 sets, like learn how to move. Once you learn how to move, okay, now it's like, let's focus on trying to move heavy things with that type of skill and improving the load, improving the reps over time. And how are we responding now? Is your physique improving from that? If it is, great. We may not have to do anything for a while. Like, we may not have to increase the volume. Eventually, you might get to a point where they're plateauing out. You don't see as much progress, strength's kind of plateauing out. Then the question becomes, okay, are you handling this? Are you low energy or high energy? And if you're handling things really well, it's like, okay, now I feel more comfortable giving you more work because you have the supply to keep it going. But if it's because of fatigue, the last thing I want to do is add more volume or more workload.
Yeah, that's a good starting point then. If you mentioned evaluating the progress and then going from there, so I know I mentioned more experienced lifters early on, but there is kind of the different categories, somebody who's brand new to this versus somebody who's experienced. Somebody brand new is probably going to be very responsive to almost anything. So let's jump ahead a little bit and say, okay, they've been lifting 6 months, maybe 12 months at least, and they're looking for that point. Are you looking for them to report out on RPE? How are you collecting that data of the response session to session? And then when you say physique development, are you just measuring and, using body measurements, or what's your gauge for that?
Use all the above. So if we're talking from a performance perspective, it's like, okay, are the numbers moving? Okay, but are the numbers moving with skill? Because you can see numbers in a spreadsheet and go, okay, yeah, it looks like 8 reps, 9 reps, 10 reps, whatever. It's like, okay, it looks like it's moving up, but then you watch the form, see how they're moving. If that skill isn't there, then it's like, okay, that's not being efficient. That's probably not being effective. So like, you might need to clean form up. Maybe you need to take a step back and go, okay, bring your loads down or whatever, and let's again hone in on the skill. And what I've been doing lately, even for myself, because I've been lifting for a very long time and I take pride in my skill level and form and all that. Like, whenever I get to a high end of a rep range with a certain load, I won't immediately go up to a new load. I'll probably roll with it 1 to 3 more sessions just to really ensure I'm very competent with it. Like, I've mastered it. Because I know when I do increase the load from that point, I'm probably going to have the same type of skill with the new load. Like, you've probably experienced this where you touch a load for the first time. You might get the reps a little shaky. You're like, okay, I completed it. And then You go to the next load, the following week, it's like, oh shit, it's just all over the place. So I think like from a skill component, I'm always thinking like, okay, let's master what we're doing first before even thinking about taking a step forward.
Yeah. That's important what you just said, because you're talking about load specific skill. I think a lot of people think it's like one and done. Like, okay, I've been progressing. I've gotten better with my form. Now I'm good, right? Like, no, like you said, the center of gravity shifts, the balance, everything about it just slightly shifts the heavier it gets. And the bar path and all that could change if you don't change something. So that's a powerful concept, Jeff, seriously, that people need to think about.
The thing about it is like, it doesn't mean you can't continue to make progress with that same load. Like you're probably still going to, like you should be hitting the appropriate proximity to failure, even if it's the same load. So you're still going to stimulus, and your muscle doesn't know numbers. Your brain does, but your muscle doesn't. Your muscle knows effort. So, and that's something like right now, I feel like, because I am advanced, I could have no spreadsheet whatsoever, not even count or track anything, but I know I'll get a stimulus every workout.
Yeah.
Because of the skill, and because of the skill getting to the appropriate proximity to failure.
Right. And is this we're talking generally 2-week progress in a typical program, like a 4 or 5 day split where you're talking your squat variant on Monday to your next Monday? Is that generally what we're talking about here?
Yeah, but that's only going to last so long. Eventually you're going to run out of like runway. Like you're not going to be able to progress weekly. Like the more advanced you are, you might be able to get 10 pounds over 6 months.
In which case is that even more biased toward rep progression?
Depending on the lift, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Think about it. You try to increase your loads every week at that point. It's like, you're going to end up being buried.
I think a lot of folks are curious about that because people get frustrated when they get stronger and they're not progressing. They know they've heard time and again, okay, I'm intermediate or I'm advanced and my lifts aren't going to go up as quickly. How do you get the sense of progress session to session?
Well, okay, so let's look at, I've been going to my son's karate classes, right? He started out as a white belt and now he's red black. He's maybe a year away from black belt. And like when I go to his classes, the expectations of a white belt, a yellow belt, blue belt, it's all different. So sometimes we expect to go from white belt to black belt, and maybe the pace early on is faster, but as you get closer to black, like then there's first degree, second degree, and it takes longer. I'm assuming it does. People are probably listening to the martial arts guys, Jeff, that's not true, but I'm assuming like going from first degree to second degree, it's going to take quite a while. Second to third takes even longer. My son's master's a 5th degree black belt. So like, I can only imagine like when he first got his black belt to 5th degree, it probably took quite a while. Or look at Olympic sprinters to get a tenth faster. They're training like 4 years to make that happen. Olympics to Olympics. So I think the expectation is like the more advanced we get, we just have to come to the realization that things are just going to move a little slower. And
let me ask you this.
Things like, right now, because I've been training for so long, I appreciate where I'm at right now a lot because I know how hard it's taken me to get to this point, and I know how hard it is to maintain it. So there's a level of appreciation for just what I'm capable of doing right now, even if it means I'm not putting on any more muscle. Yeah, and I think that's where some people fall short. They're always like wanting to go move ahead, take a step, but they're not slowing down and appreciating what they're actually accomplished.
Yeah. And that's kind of the topic we're getting at today and that's why I think it's more relevant to more intermediate to advanced lifters is they want to see the progress they used to have and may not in the same way. It's progress that has to be measured differently. And the question for some of them is, how do I shift my perspective and what I measure to properly gauge that and not feel like I'm just plateauing, right? That's part of it. And then also I don't just hop to another program like, okay, it's not working for me. I'm going to go to West Side now, and now I'm going to go to the 6-day hypertrophy program over here. Considering that my audience is probably a normal curve, but shifted slightly more toward less experience, but not, what would you say to those people? And I'm thinking a lot of guys my age who basically like, they started with starting strength or something like that, 5x5s, then they shifted over to some sort of split intermediate programming and they're expecting, load to keep going up. And like you said, it's not going to happen. So what do they switch to? And I'm asking you what sounds like dumb questions. I hope I know some of these answers, but for the audience,
No, they're good. They're good questions. And like, I consider myself someone who uses intermediate programming, but I've mastered it because I know with intermediate programming, the principles are in place. And that's what it comes down to is understanding principles of training. Once you know principles, then you get a lot more comfortable with programming because you know there's nothing magical about an upper lower split, a push pull leg split, full bodies, like all that stuff. As you know, it's just ways to organize your frequency, your intensity, and the volume. So when you think from that perspective, it's like, okay, this week I can run an upper lower split. Next week I can do push pull legs. The following week I can do a full body split. And as long as I'm, hitting my baseline volumes that what I need, I'm able to perform it really well. I get to the appropriate proximity to failure with skill. I'm getting plenty of recovery. I'm well fueled. Chances are across those 3 weeks, it's probably going to be the same result at the end of the day. But maybe some very tiny, maybe differences one way or another, but we're talking like splitting hairs, and that's why I wore a hat today, so I don't have to show my bald head.
Understand? No, all good. All good.
No, that's a joke, but yeah. But I think that's just as an intermediate, it's just like, because in a sense, when you're a beginner or intermediate, you're not where you want to be yet.
Yes.
So there's going to be a sense of urgency. It's a double-edged sword, though, if you're like pushing yourself too much, or you're trying to flip-flop training programs because you're trying to look for this shiny object to get you there faster. But at the other side of the sword, it's like, because you're changing maybe things up too frequently, then you kind of lose sight of like what's actually working and what's not, because you're changing things out too much. That's why I'm an intermediate programmer for myself, because it's just straightforward. It's very consistent. It's easier for me to assess what's working and what isn't working. Things that work, you keep it in there. Things that don't work, you're like, let me explore. But it's not changing out the entire programming. I might say, well, okay, this certain exercise, it's not really grooving right now. Okay, let me find a different movement that's going to hit the same body part. Let's change it out and see how this one works. So I'm only changing one, maybe two variables at most. It's easier to, okay, now I know, okay, I ran this for 2 months. Now I know exactly what happened with this one change. It's either positive or negative. And again, if it's a positive, keep it. If it's a negative, find something else. And eventually you keep evolving. You keep evolving over time. And that's how you get experience. That's how you get more comfortable, with keeping an intermediate program in a sense.
I like that you're almost qualifying the word intermediate as if it could be taken as an insult, right? For an advanced person. I like how you frame that. I
could take starting strength and probably make it advanced running it, because there's a difference in skill level versus me now versus me in year one.
Yeah.
I can almost guarantee you I probably I'm getting older now. It's harder to make gains, but you know what I'm saying? I can probably perform exceptionally well using that and recover well because of the skill level.
Yeah. I mean, you're the poster child for those listening who don't know Jeff already.
White belt, black belt, right?
Yeah. Look up Jeff though. I mean, again, age is not a factor on this. He demonstrates that, but you talked about principles, and that's like the magic word. I did want to come back to that because everybody has their like, here's my 5 pillars of lifting or my 3 principles. And you'll talk about progressive loading or overload. You'll talk about mechanical tension and talk about volume, frequency, intensity. Like, can you simplify that for us? Like in your mind, what are those principles?
I think when we think about, so if we're talking about programming, right?
Yeah. Programming.
I mean, we could look at the science, right? Okay, we got to hit body parts 2 to 3 times per week, maybe 4, but I think 4 is a stretch for most everyday people. Even 3 can be a stretch. Even once per week can elicit some progress. So, I mean, sweet spots maybe 2 or 3 times a week. So you look at that. You look at, the volume. We know the 10 to 20 sets thing, but again, I lean more towards on the lower end when I'm starting somebody out to get skill development first. And then after a while, you're like, maybe we can start gravitating higher. But I think of that, we're 10 to 20, somewhere in that ballpark. Proximity to failure based on a rep range. So if we know through the science, anywhere between 5 to 30 reps creates hypertrophy. So it's more about proximity to failure in relation to the rep range you're using. Lower reps, you can be further away from failure. I mean, still has to be within reason. And then the higher the reps are, you got to get close to it or at failure to ensure you are getting enough muscle fiber, while you're doing the lift. So when you look at those principles, it's like, so then from there, I'm like, based on someone's context, the question I'll ask somebody is, how many days per week can you train where it doesn't interrupt your life schedule? Because when you're in the gym, the last thing you want to be worrying about is, I got to take my kids to school, or my wife's upset at me because I'm in the gym for 3 hours, or I'm there 6 days a week, I'm not spending time with the family. So when you're in the gym, you just want to be stress-free. So that way, when you are lifting, it's just all about you. And that's where you're going to get probably your best performance. So once I know how many days per week they can train, then it's like, can I get the frequency 2 to 3 times? or does it have to be once? Because that's going to be practical. It may not be optimal according to science, but it's optimal according to that person based on their constraints. So they're going to maximize themselves far better because they're doing something that's going to be lower stress. And then from there, get into the weeds, like, okay, let's talk about exercise selection. And I don't look at exercise selection. I was like, okay, this guy on this podcast said this is the most optimal thing. I look at it as like, does the exercise hit the muscle I'm trying to target? Is it safe and comfortable for me? Do I have good stability while doing it? And do I enjoy doing it? Because if those things check out, then it's a good exercise regardless what anybody else says.
Yeah, those are solid principles. I like how you said this is optimal for the person, right? Because at the end of the day, it ties back to what you mentioned earlier about pace and what's practical, sustainable, and what is your life context. I laugh when you talk about days per week because for me personally, and I've seen it with a lot of my clients, that often is the thing. That's the main constraint. And if you're hung up on that or like you get fixated on the other principles, and so you pick this program and you just can't stick with it because of your life, like forget about it. I also think of sleep in that regard, right? Or fat loss where you've got all this extra stress. You might want that extra day just to sleep an extra hour. And that can make all the difference in the whole week.
Yeah. So people try to, they fit I want to train 6 days a week because they think more is better, or the insecurity. They think they're not going to make gains if they're not there. Or some people just love to train to a fault.
Right.
So
they like to just be in the gym.
I want to be I would love to be in the gym 7 days a week because obviously I love to train, but I also know that's not realistic to my life schedule. It's also not realistic to my recovery. And I've said this on other podcasts, but I look at, I don't look at bodybuilders that much anymore to learn about bodybuilding. I look at other sports because they do a far better job at managing their performance and their recovery. Because sports is all performance based. So you look at, football, baseball, basketball, they're like, baseball is a good example of starting pitchers. There's a reason the managers keep track of the pitch count and the number of days they're pitching in a week, because they know if this pitcher is getting fatigued, they're not going to have the velocity and the control on their pitches.
Yeah,
but
actually,
as bodybuilders, like, hey, let's throw 150 pitches. So to me, it just doesn't make sense. The way people think about bodybuilding sometimes. So I'm like, let me use these principles from other sports and apply it to my bodybuilding, apply it to my athletes. And usually you get a nice balance, nice harmony with like performance, recovery, plus real life stuff.
Yeah, that's a great point because I'm big into sports documentaries now, the ones like on Netflix. There's one that just came out called The Comeback about the Red Sox Yankees 2004. Got to see. It's funny you mentioned that because both Pedro and also Curt Schilling, they talk about both of them. Pedro being pushed to well beyond his limit in the series that they lost in 2003, and then the manager was fired for it. And then Curt Schilling, he had a tendon issue and he just could not pitch it was like the first game of the series in 2004. And then when he came back the next time, they talked about how his surgeon did this wonky, stapling his tendon to his bone or something on his ankle to stabilize it.
I remember the bloody sock, remember?
Yeah, the bloody sock, exactly. So I'm like, that is such a great example of taking what the heck do athletes do? Tom Brady getting 11 hours of sleep, that'd be great to see what they do to manage this, the fatigue. So I want to play off one of those principles then that comes to mind is the proximity to failure. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding there as well. You reiterated the understanding that there's a wide rep range and that to choose from. So let's get out of the old school, like strength versus hypertrophy regime or whatever. Sure. But a lot of people do think they have to train really right up to failure. And, I know Dr. Israel and others have always thrown out the 2 to 3 rep range. And then even more recent research, I think that Mike Zordo's, the big main analysis that came out recently talked about six reps from failure even being effective. So
what is that though? What do you mean? That meaning if I would have someone who's new or even an intermediate, what's 6 reps in the tank? I don't even know what 6 reps in the tank.
So far from.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's even hard to gauge what 4 in the tank is.
You're right. RPE gets criticized for that. Yeah.
1 to 2 reps in the tank. That's pretty easy. It's hey, I can tell you, I need you to, when you think you just can't do anymore, just stop.
Yeah.
Right there, right?
When you mentally think you can't,
okay,
you probably do 2 reps.
Stop.
Yeah.
You're probably really close to where we need you to be and without having to get overly analytical on things.
I like that.
And then failure is to teach failure is just, you have someone do a tricep press down or a lateral and say, hey, I want you to go until you just cannot move anymore. And then you get a better gauge.
So we mentioned starting strength earlier, and there's many examples of that are sets across like get all the reps and then progress the load type programs. And
Mhm.
again, maybe this is going more toward newer lifters. They're not thinking of proximity to failure. They're just thinking get all the reps and
The
increase the weight
numbers.
next time.
Yeah.
Right.
Not
How
a
does
bad
that
idea
play?
to pay
Yeah. Yeah.
attention to, like, take notes. Hey, I hit 10 reps. I got the top end, but how many more could you have done? Was that like, if you barely squeaked that out,
Yep.
or oh, it was kind of easy?
And then that informs the jump for next time, perhaps.
Exactly.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So it's
Exactly.
not just, instead of just analyzing the numbers, analyze actually how it felt to move those numbers.
Yeah.
And it kind of goes back to what I said earlier. Like, even though I hit that top end and I hit all my reps across the board, and first time I'm not going to, jump to the next load. I'm going to, like, let me practice this. Going back to sports, right? Like, people get better at sports by practice. Let's practice that 100 pounds I hit for 10 reps. Let's practice that 1, 2, 3 more times to get more competent with it, to master it.
Yeah.
So I think that's undervalued.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's why people should stick with certain lifts for more than a couple weeks, at least early on, just to, for the practice alone, let alone the progress and neuromuscular adaptation and all that. You mentioned the getting the data and letting that inform your jumps. I had a client text me and she said something like, so my plan is to jump by this many pounds, and then when I get to this load, I'm going to drop it. I said, no, that's back. That's kind of backward. Don't assume anything.
Right.
3 or 4 weeks down the road, let's judge session by session. You may be able to go up higher. I don't want to even put limits on yourself until you get there, or maybe less, right? So that's good. All right. So you're a natural athlete. There's a big distinction between, for natural athletes specifically, and the life of their training and the expectations. I think some people skew what they think they can get maybe out of bodybuilding or physique sports in general. What are your thoughts on realistic expectations for natural athletes? And I'm thinking muscle growth, but I really mean the longevity stuff we're talking about here.
Yeah. I mean, everything comes to an end, right? And that's with anything in life. So I think, even for me, like, I thought about this the last few years because I haven't really seen too much muscle size. I don't think realistically, I don't think I'm probably going to get any bigger because I can tell my joints are kind of preventing me from lifting probably, heavier loads and that type of thing. But also it's just age. So it's accepting that, like, come to the conclusion, like, okay, things are slower. So especially with natural bodybuilding, it's slower. I think we just have to come to terms and embrace that. But it doesn't mean you can't have a long shelf life with progress. You've probably heard the 5-year, shelf, right? It's like
genetic potential in 5 years.
Yeah, 5 years. Like, I mean, you got to be, like, assuming you're a perfect robot. Okay, yeah, maybe you get all that in 5 years, but how many perfect robots are there? First year, you're learning how to lift still. Second year, you're like, okay, now I'm learning how to progress well. So you're starting to really move up. You're going from white to yellow to brown. Like, you're getting all these belts early on, but eventually you're getting to the brown belt. You're getting to the red, black, and the black belts, and things do start to slow. But who's to say that it's over in 5 years? You might see a little more growth from years 5 through 10. Look at Eric Helms is a good example. 41 years old and he's still making some pretty decent gains.
Yeah.
They're not as fast as when he first started lifting, but for an advanced lifter, they're kind of fast. It's like kind of seeing some nice changes.
Yeah.
And he's learning more about himself, though. That's the thing. He's learning how his body still ticks. And even myself, as you evolve, you learn yourself. Like, years 1 through 5, you might have done certain things. Years 5 through 10, you started changing, you're evolving. And then years 15 to 20, same thing. But progress is more than just putting tissue on, because if you're a competitive natural bodybuilder, there's a skill component of learning how to diet, learning the pace of the diet, retaining muscle mass. That's something that I learned when I was 38 years old. I got my pro cards a little late in life, but I was 160 pounds. 2 years later, I competed as a pro. I was 170 pounds. It was a 10-pound difference. Everybody was blown away. They're like, there's no way this guy's natural. He didn't gain 10 pounds of muscle in 2 years at 40 years old. No, I just learned how to diet better. I learned how to retain muscle better. So it's just, there's different levels, and there's different ways to create progress outside of just like, I got bigger muscles.
So when did you actually start seriously training? How old were you?
Well, I started lifting at 14. I've always been,
okay.
I didn't know what I was doing, but I can go back to when I was a teenager. I was lifting hella hard.
Yeah.
Like, all I knew was lift hard and go to failure. So early on, I had really fast development. From 14 to 17, I packed on a decent amount of muscle. And by the time I got out of high school, I was benching 330 at 165. So I had some pretty fast gains. And then since then, it's kind of been like up and down, up and down. That's just because of my knowledge level. Like, back then, there was no internet. So I was like kind of just doing things on my own, trying to figure stuff out. So there was a lot of ups and downs.
Oh, and the reason I asked so selfishly, but also again, I know a lot of guys like me who didn't start until, in my case, late 30s. I mean, I did CrossFit for like 8 years up and down, but that was not lifting. And so I'm in my first 1 to 5 years at the age of 44. Like I'm, and I don't even know if I've taken full advantage of that, but like there's probably a lot of people wondering, maybe what's the potential for a 40-year-old? What's the potential for a 60-year-old?
Let me ask you questions since you brought it up for yourself. So you've been hypertrophy lifting for 5 years, 6 years?
Since 2020. Yeah.
2020. Out of the last 4 years, how much of that time have you spent in a deficit?
Probably a year.
So 3 years. Out of those 3 years, like well-structured training?
I think so, yes.
With plenty of effort?
I believe so. I train consistently and hard. Point? Yeah, I mean, I'm a nutrition coach. I hope so.
So yeah, there you go. So you still, I mean, you got 3 years of like really dedicated hypertrophy lifting.
Right. So there's a lot of potential.
Exactly. You're only 44. So you still have like probably a good decade ahead of you where you can probably continue to maximize yourself.
Let me ask a different question.
1%, 10%, 50%, who knows?
Yeah.
But the thought is like, I'm going to try. I'm going to put that effort in. I'm going to make sure all the big rocks are in place and let's see what happens.
Yeah, it's a positive. Yeah, I was going to ask a different twist on that. And I'm actually not going to. The question was going to be, well, then somebody who's older, what are they never able to accomplish because they started late? And I think that's a terrible question because it doesn't matter.
It is, right?
Right? Like, but people are thinking that, people beat themselves up. Like, I wish I started when I was 20, but I didn't.
Could happen if you don't try, you don't know. Then
exactly,
that's right there. That's where
you can get massively
not trying.
Massive growth from wherever you are. Yeah, that's good stuff, man. I have to say, for folks watching or listening, like Jeff peers deep into your soul, and again, he's probably a really good coach for that reason.
I try to make the podcast as real as possible. Like
it's good. It's good. It's good.
It's like, how many sets should I be doing? That's what I was like. No, let's talk. Let's be real. Let's talk like practical.
I agree. Yeah, I've spent a lot of time talking about tactics, and I agree. It's more fun to get into philosophy and approach because then people can take that and mold it as they need for their approach. Or they can reach out to guys like you and me and say, okay, now how do I personalize that for myself? But okay, so what was the next thing I wanted to cover here? Fatigue management is kind of another corollary. And specifically what I'm thinking is, you mentioned yourself, joint health. And a lot of guys or women I hear about their low back fatigue. Yeah. Everybody has back issues. We know that, quote unquote, of some kind as they get older. But lifters, especially, who might be deadlifting a lot or doing some other movement. How do we manage all that? How do we manage fatigue management is, I guess, the question.
Supply and demand, right? So the way I look at this is supply is your food, right? Your rest days, your sleep. Your demand is going to be your training itself. Could be cardio, could be steps, life stuff, work, relationships. What else did I miss out? If you're in a deficit, let's say you're in a deficit, that's a demand. So you see where you're at with the supply and demand. Like obviously if you're in, let's say in a dieting phase, cutting phase, your demand is going to be higher than your supply. So from that perspective, you have to understand like, okay, how long am I dieting? Is this a short-term cut? Is it a long-term cut? Short-term cut, you might be able to get away with a few more things because it's shorter in nature. But if you're in a long-term dieting phase, then it's like, okay, now maybe these refeeds are super important. Day, 1 day, 2 days out of the week where you got higher food intake. So again, you're bringing the supply up to kind of match up to your demand to give you some relief there because you want to try to maximize your performance. And that's what's really key because obviously most people's goals is they want to get bigger and they want to be leaner. So in order to do that, you have to manage the fatigue. So it's pretty important that your performance is elevated as much as possible so you can maintain that muscle mass. And then you think about your pace too when you're dieting down 0.5 to 1% of your body weight per week. Anything more than that, it's going to be a grind. It's going to be hard to perform. It's going to be hard to recover.
That's huge.
Life's going to suck. Your spouse isn't going to like you too much. You're going to be moody, cranky, those types of things. So you have to take all that into consideration. But the whole podcast could be about fatigue management.
Of course.
And you could look, again, going back to the sports arena. I was hitting up Google a few years back on NBA basketball. I was trying to figure out the winning percentages of teams that played back-to-back games.
Okay.
Because usually NBA schedules, they'll play 2 or 3 games a week, somewhere in there. Mm-hmm. So the back-to-backs, the second game, the losing percentage was much lower than the first game. Of course, you take into consideration some teams are better than others. But in general, like the losing percentage was higher on the second game, which makes sense because they're tired. They played the day before.
Yeah.
So again, like sometimes with training, when you're like, if you're training, let's say 2, 3, 4 days in a row, that fatigue builds up. Naturally, it's going to build up if you're well fed. But imagine if you're dieting 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 training days in a row, like you start getting beat up towards the end of the week, you're feeling it. So sometimes it's like, okay, how can we manage that? It's like, instead of training 2 or 3 days in a row, why don't you go every other day? You train hard. Like as bodybuilders, we train hard. So train hard, take a day off, recover. You be refreshed the next day, and then take another day off. And so, or you can go 2 on, 1 off. So looking at frequency, that's something you look at. Intensity, not training as close to failure. Maybe that can help. Maybe dropping down some set volume, eating more food, those types of things, more sleep. Like, I mean, just the list goes on and on. But again, it's like, I think looking at bodybuilders per se is like probably not the area I usually look towards first. It's more like those other sports.
No, I like that. And I took a note because this is, I want to build off that later on for another episode because, using other sports as an analogy, I don't think enough people do that. And
boxing, here, boxing. Like, right? Boxer goes out there. It's a hard round. Like, well, I got to go 12 rounds here. And if I'm not able to knock this opponent out in the next 1 or 2 rounds, I got to pace this. So, you've heard this. Boxers like, okay, they took a round off. What does that mean? They're staying on the outside. They're not trying to get hit. They're just doing enough to get them through the round. Now I'm going to go sit down and rest for a full minute. And then the next round, now I can go on the attack. Yeah. So it's the same thing when I look at my training. Like, if I go in there for a day or 2 and I attack hard, like I'm going to pull back. I'm going to have a day or 2. I'm just not train and recover. So every time I'm in there, I'm like fresh and getting the most performance out of myself.
My name is Tony. I'm a strength lifter in my 40s. And I'd just like to say thank you to Phil and his Wits and Weights community for helping me learn more about nutrition and how to implement better ideas into my strength training. Phil has a very, very good understanding of macros and chemical compounds and hormones and all that. And he's continuously learning. And that's what I like about Phil. He's got a great sense of humor. We'll go back and forth. He's very relaxed, very easy to talk to. One of the greatest things about Phil, in my view, is that he practices what he preaches. He also works out with barbells. He trains heavy, not as heavy as me, but he trains heavy. He lifts, so he knows programs. He knows different variations. So if you talk with him about getting in better shape or eating better, he's probably going to give you some good advice, and I would strongly recommend you talk with him, and he'll help you out. Thanks.
All right. So a couple things come to mind then from this. First is just the general thought for folks who think that there's only one way to solve fatigue, and that is to stop doing the movement or to switch movements. And like, you didn't even go there. You said, like, think about the supply and demand. Oftentimes it's the supply you need more of or less of the demand, depending on what's possible. And then you mentioned pacing just being a way to move your training around to help with the fatigue, but you're still getting the same, potentially the same volume and intensity, even though those are other variables. What are your thoughts then on the opposite structure for helping with fatigue? And that is, let's say you're doing 3 day a week and you switch to 6 day a week, but half the sessions. Is that a strategy?
That's a strategy. Yeah. So if you're doing, let's just use total sets of a workout. Let's say you're doing 20 sets and you take it down to 10 and you're spreading it all out. Yeah. I mean, it's going to be easier to get through the training session. It's all theory, of course. Easier to get through the session than maybe your recovery. Better. Yeah. The question then becomes, you got to pay attention to is like, okay, if you're going from 3 days, I don't know how you're organized 3 days, if it's, 1 on, 1 off, 1 on, 1 off, or
let's say every other day or whatever. Yeah.
Every other day. Now you're going 6 straight days. So then you have to kind of pay attention to what are things feeling like on day 4, day 5, and day 6. Even though you've cut the volume in half, you still want to take notes on that. Because even though you're doing less work too, like think of your connective tissue. You're using your connective tissue 6 days out of the week instead of 3, even though it's less work. So you still have to just pay attention to all those variables. In theory, it makes sense, but again, you got to pay attention to it.
And personalize it for you. Yeah, it makes sense. So connective tissue, again, good segue. And let's talk about that, the joint health, the connective tissue. Maybe again, there's some misconceptions there. Some people oversimplify this stuff like, well, if you lift heavy, it's bad for your joints. We know that's not necessarily the case, but what are your thoughts on connective tissue, tendon health, and things like that for older folks?
Am I an older folk?
With age, I guess there's a correlation with age, right?
Yeah.
You said it yourself.
It's hard for me to say how other people feel, what they
Yeah.
feel. Like I know how I feel, and I've noticed the last few years, like, yeah, I got to pay closer attention to it. And like you said, it's not so much the load, because sometimes I can handle load pretty well. And sometimes the opposite. You would think like,
Yeah.
okay, if the load is heavy, it hurts, I'm going to go light load, but then your reps go way up.
Reps go. Yeah.
So
then
now
it's a
you're getting more
repetition
like,
on that.
yeah, now you're doing like 100 reps instead of 20. So that can wear your connective tissue out too. So like for me, what really helps me is rep speed, like rep cadence sometimes. Like in the moment, I'm controlling that. Like, you know, like when you're driving a car on a road, you feel a bump. You're like, okay, I'm going to avoid that bump and move the steering wheel, or the traffic in front of me slowing down, put my foot on the brakes. That's kind of how I think about my rep speed. I'm paying attention to how things feel. So if my shoulder, like my right shoulder gets pissed off quite a lot, like when I'm pressing. So sometimes like my elbow, I'll have to do this, or I'll shift it in. I'll even move my shoulder in a little bit, those types of things, just to avoid like, you know, the aches and pains.
That's really good, actually. Rep speed, cadence, grip width, grip angle. Those are really, really good tweaks.
Even like on my like I do this movement. It's kind of like a hybrid, like a press fly. It's like not a fly, but it's more like a press and a fly at the same time. So the way I hold the dumbbells in my palm, someone asked me about this, like, you know, about their shoulders and that movement. I'm like, why I hold it this way? I didn't really realize I was doing it, and the reason why, it was more instinctual. But I realized is instead of having that handle like flush and you're gripping it hard, the dumbbell's like sitting in my hand, and then put the tips of my fingers right in the middle of the handle.
The pads of your fingers and thumb over.
Yeah, like it's
okay.
And it just eliminates the shoulder discomfort I have. I don't know why. It just does. It's more of an instinctual. But those are the types of things that's worth exploring, whether you're young or old. Like if you're experiencing any type of discomfort, you play around with grip spacing, the way you're holding things, rep cadence. Because oftentimes we'll look at like, okay, should we be doing like slow eccentrics? Should we be doing fast explosive concentrics? Because we're looking at science stuff. It's like, how about you go by what feels actually comfortable for you?
Agree. Yeah. Like for me recently, I had rotator cuff surgery last year. And for me, just pausing made all the difference.
Yes.
You know, on everything.
Yep.
You know, even in like bicep curls, you just pause at the bottom, and it makes it harder, you know, in a different way.
Even range of motion too. Like I'll play around with that. Like I'll cut range of motion short sometimes if there's, you know, if I'm experiencing some pain, whether it's at the top or the bottom, whatever. I was doing a couple of years back, I was doing Smith machine bench presses, but I set the safety arms up to about 2/3 range of the motion. I cut the bottom, like the stretch portion out.
So it's a pin press, a pin bench press.
Yeah, just like slow eccentric, because it didn't really bother my shoulders too much. Slow on the way down, maybe, I don't know, close to 4 seconds. Pause it at the bottom, kills the momentum. And then when I would start the movement, so instead of thinking of pushing off the pins with a lot of force, like a race car, for example, more like a diesel truck. Like, let me just move it slow with a lot of torque, ease into it. And then as it goes, the bar is traveling up, then I'm pressing faster. And that's to avoid the shoulder discomfort. Now the question becomes, is that more effective than like just the traditional cadence? You're more explosive, using heavier loads, maybe? As long as, this is why I see it, I could be wrong, but as long as I'm going to failure or close to it, I'm probably getting a stimulus regardless.
And as you mentioned before, the alternative is you're not going to do it because it hurts. So
it hurts, yeah, exactly. And it's a baseline too, because even though, let's say it is suboptimal, it's my baseline. It's what I can do comfortably. And the goal is still the same. The goal is still to try to increase more load over time and more reps over time. So I'm still elevating performance and elevating volume.
Yeah, I like that. And there's so many movements, angles, ranges of motion across all the possible exercises that you could complement it with things to kind of fill in the gap. The example of a race or a car engine, I'm thinking like, you know, physics and power and explosiveness and speed. There's a whole velocity component to it. That is kind of the principle behind all this almost, if we're to sum it up, so that when you're listening to the show, if you want to train next time you go train, experiment with that both at the bottom of the rep, right?
Yeah.
With
like
your pause.
When you start a rep out, like think of it like, if let's say you're at a red light and you're in this Porsche, right? It's got some just high end, torque. Light turns green, you punch it. What's going to happen? More than likely the tires are going to spin out. The back end's starting to squirrel a little bit. So you're like, but you get a diesel truck and you punch it, green light, what's going to happen? that truck's not going to squirrel it anymore. It's like there's a lot of torque though. There's a lot of power, but there's more control.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I think about when I start some of my exercises out. I think more like a diesel truck versus the race car. And in a sense, it kind of keeps the tension where you want it throughout the entirety of the rep.
And that mind muscle there. Yeah. I'm imagining wheels spinning on my tendons and like wearing them down, you know, with the race car. That's good stuff. Yeah, no, this is great. Being mindful and reflective of every rep just to make sure. So like if we circle back, tendon, joint health, you know, rather than making drastic changes, rather than hopping around, tweak the movement you think is the offender, see if it makes a difference. Grip with angle, play with different bars too. Like they've got multi-grip bars and you've got cambered bars and like all this fun stuff. You can mix it up. Yeah, even like I'm thinking pull-ups and chin-ups again, you might find it's a game changer to just widen or shorten up that grip or go neutral. So good stuff. All right, so I'm looking at my questions. We actually covered a lot of what I was going to ask. You even talked about like, you know, cutting and dieting, how the rate of your cut is extremely important and it adds to the stress if you go faster. I think that is really important because rather than it being a training issue, it could be a resource issue, right? It could be a food issue.
Yeah.
And unless you have some timeline, perhaps, which I know bodybuilders do when they have a show, if you can plan ahead far enough, it sounds like, you know, taking the most conservative approach that still gets you the result and doesn't impede too much is a good idea. But what about the psychological toll of it taking too long, right? Like, what are your thoughts? Now we're getting into dieting here.
No, I like
a whole separate topic.
Because there's different perspectives. Yeah.
Right? It's like long and slow or really fast or super fast. Like, I know the answer is it depends because different people respond differently. But
it does depend, but I tend to lean more towards being conservative because when you're conservative, you in a sense, you have a bigger playbook. If you're giving yourself a short timeline to make something happen, it's almost like you have to be like perfect. So here's a good way to think about it. Like if I gave you 30 seconds to tie both shoes, probably get the job done pretty easily, right? And your shoes are going to look pretty clean. Like, you know, okay, those bows look really good. But if I said, I'm going to give you 10 seconds or maybe 8 seconds to tie those two shoes, and I want you to make it look really good, chances are it's not going to look that great. And the process itself is going to be super stressful.
Yeah, you're going to fumble through. Yeah, right.
Or you're piloting an airplane and I give you a mile to get this plane off the ground, but then I give you a quarter mile. Like, what's the experience going to be like in those two different situations? What are the passengers going to experience? It's going to be a smooth takeoff in a mile. Like, okay, we're building speed up. Okay, we're going to get the plane off the ground. Okay, we're going to gradually get it to altitude. But quarter mile is like, man, you better make sure you didn't eat too close to that takeoff because you're going to lose your lunch.
And Jeff, I'll tell you, on a landing, it's even worse. I used to fly planes, and when I had to do a short,
perfect.
When I had to do a short runway landing, this is just small Cessnas, but like if I had my wife or a friend in there, and there was a crosswind, you're talking a weird angle and a steep angle, and it's just they all got sick. So you're right; it's a good example.
Am I good with the takeoff, or I need to change that up?
Yeah,
I like to use that one.
No, takeoffs are good too because you need to crank up the throttle and but you have to have a minimum regardless for physics, you know, to like work. But yeah, it's good. Okay, that's good to hear because we do sometimes equivocate on all that. And it's like, well, whatever works for you. But like you said, you get more flexibility and options when it's a longer time frame and you're more conservative.
When you're dieting, like if it's short in nature and you're trying, you know, let's say you're trying to lose 20 pounds in 8 weeks, 20 or 10 weeks, even something like that. That's super fast. Like you're going to have to be very aggressive. So you may think like, okay, I'm going to get this over with sooner, but you're going to suffer more in that time span versus like, I'm going to double up that timeline because now you're going to have a more conservative pace. So what you're actually experiencing as you're not as fatigued. So it's easier to cope in that situation versus like,
and for a long
1,500 calories and I got to do like all these cardio sessions just to get this fat loss off. And then your training suffering. So the end goal is to look the part. It's not to hit a certain number. It's actually more visual when you're a bodybuilder. Or even if it's a cosmetic goal, like you want to look the part at the end of it. You want to have your muscle intact. So I always feel like you're just giving yourself more time. And then the life factors too. You know, you think about a short timeline, you may not have the luxury of like being able to take your wife out for dinner on a Saturday night.
More trade-offs.
I got up to 1,500. I can't do it. I'm on so low calories, but I have double the timeline. I'm like, well, I'm going to create a buffer. I'm going to take my wife out and have a good time and still make my goals.
Yeah, I love that too because the longer it is and the more you stretch it out, the more resilience you have against all of those things happening because, you know, life throws unexpected things along the way. including injuries, including sickness, including something with your kid or your wife or whatever. And to be able to, if you're going at a conservative rate, interrupting that has a much less impact as well, right? Because not dieting for a few days when you're already at a very conservative deficit isn't a big deal.
Yeah.
But if you're, if it's a 4 or 6 week mini cut, all of a sudden one day makes a big difference.
And another thing to think about too, let's say you have to do a long-term dieting phase. Doesn't mean you have to be like downhill the whole way through.
Mm-hmm.
So you can say, I'm going to go 4 weeks of dieting, 1 week not. 4 weeks of dieting, 1 week not. Or I'm going to do 3 and 1, or I'm going to do 5 and 2, or whatever. It doesn't have to be a straight shot.
It's true.
And the way I see it too, like if you think about your behaviors, like think about your behaviors if you're dieting for 8 weeks and it's super hard. Like your behaviors with that's going to be your food behaviors, like everything's going to be off. But if it's conservative, then it's going to be pretty even keel. It's going to look more or less like how you do things when you're not dieting.
Right. Just scaled a little bit. Yeah.
Exactly.
So
that's, again, it's going back to practicality and sustainability. So something we got to think about, okay, how's this going to impact me when it's all said and done?
Cool.
Sometimes we don't think that far ahead.
Yeah, I'm all for that flexibility. I inadvertently went into what I did a podcast about it a while back called my stair-step fat loss approach. And it was just literally because of what happened to my shoulder and needing to recover several times over the last few months, I got out of my dieting phase. I'm like, you know what? This is much better to just go 3 weeks on, 1 week off, 3 weeks on, 1 week, kind of like a staircase. And that relief from that week or two of maintenance can be huge.
Made a big difference, yeah.
Where it almost doesn't feel, the dieting almost doesn't feel like dieting. It's almost this huge sustainable thing. Cool, man. All right. So in the interest of time, I just wanted to ask you if there's anything we didn't cover or a question you wish I had asked from here and what your answer would be.
No, I thought you did great. I thought we covered a lot.
I thought you did great too, man. It was fun.
Now I'm like, man, I need to learn more about flying now.
I could hook you up with some people that know a lot more than I do, but yeah, it was fun. I stopped when the gas became too expensive and I had kids. I was like, okay, I'm done.
I can see that, yeah.
But I do know some pilots having worked in the aerospace industry. So anyway, man, where do you want people to learn about you, Jeff, and reach out to you?
3DMJ_Godfather. Go to YouTube, Team 3D Muscle Journey.
Cool. I'll put those in the show notes, and Jeff's super responsive and really good content online as well. Wouldn't believe he's whatever age he is. I'm not even going to say a number because, it doesn't matter, does it?
43 plus 10.
There you go. Yeah. All right, man. It's great to have you on. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
All right. Thanks again.